and culturally significant species in our recreational saltwater fishery. The study was commissioned and funded by BTT and conducted by FIU under the able leadership of Dr. Rahej, serving as principal investigator. 93 bonefish were sampled in multiple locations in Biscayne Bay and the Florida Keys. A total of 58 pharmaceuticals were detected with an average of 7 pharmaceuticals per fish. The list includes commonly prescribed medications and even opioids. These findings are troubling on many fronts, 2 of particular concern. First, pharmaceutical contamination was detected at levels high enough to have biological effects on the fish, thus posing a risk or a threat to our fishery. And second, the contamination is not limited to bonefish, but also likely present in other fishes, crabs, lobster, and other nearshore marine life. The source of this contamination is human waste and a wastewater infrastructure that has been pressed beyond its technological capability and capacity, at least to meet the demands of today. On behalf of Bonefish and Tarpon Trust, we thank Governor Ron DeSantis for his leadership and commitment to Florida's environment, including historic levels of funding for clean water, and to the Florida legislature for rising these challenges through new state programs. The establishment of the wastewater grants program is a great example that bears on today's discussion. Taken together, these represent important steps forward. If anything, the results we share today underscore the urgency for the legislature to not only approve the governor's budget request, but to look for ways to increase funding and accelerate work under state programs to modernize and expand wastewater infrastructure. At this time, I'm pleased to ask Dr. Rahej to walk us through the results of this study.
Thank you, Jim. How's it sound? You guys listening? Good. Wonderful. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for being here for Bonefish remotely. And good morning, everyone. So I want to start by highlighting how important it is and reminding us how important water quality is to all of us as Canadians. It's huge. It's very close to all of our hearts. It's also really important for our recreational fisheries. We have the highest economic impact fisheries. We have the most anglers and the highest quality of fishing in the U.S. This is super important. Recreational fishing is a core part of our identity as Floridians, and a core part of our culture and our tourism-driven economy. It's huge in the state. And we're all very familiar with the visible threats of water quality, the poor water quality we see with algal blooms, turbidity. So today I want to highlight the value and the importance of these invisible threats. They're equally threatening, they're concerning, yet they're not readily seen by the eye. And this brings us to pharmaceuticals, as Jim described. These are the prescription medications that we take to keep us healthy. And we're seeing increasing indications that these pharmaceuticals are resulting in pharmaceutical pollution as they reach our aquatic environments and we put them at risk. The average American consumes 18 prescriptions per year. This is more than 4 billion prescriptions yearly in the US alone. This is half the world consumption of pharmaceuticals. Florida ranks 3rd. In fact, the rate of production and release of these pharmaceuticals into the environment is far outpacing our ability to assess their safety once they enter the environment. You see in this graphic, the global pharmaceutical production is incredibly skyrocketing compared to other things we care about, such as human population growth or CO2 emissions. So how do pharmaceuticals become pollutants? This is where we're here to address. We have a lack of treatment to remove those pharmaceuticals from wastewater, and then we have wastewater effluent itself that reaches and comes in close contact with our environments, with our fish habitats, and our fisheries. So we ingest the prescriptions prescribed to us by our doctors. We excrete those prescriptions at our households, and then our wastewater goes either to a septic system or to a sewer line out to a wastewater treatment. In Florida, 1/3 of households have septic systems and 2/3 sewer lines that take that to a wastewater. And neither of these removes pharmaceuticals. Conventional wastewater treatment that's used in Florida and all of the US, actually, most of the world, does not remove pharmaceuticals and these new contaminants that we are synthesizing worldwide. We have evidence that wastewater effluent then comes into contact with coastal waters where we have our valuable fisheries. And once there, it's persistent and constant. So we have a leakage in our sewage lines. We can have a constant supply of these pharmaceuticals on the water. Important to note that there's no current regulations for the production nor the disposal of pharmaceuticals. So they're not considered a contaminant. They're designed to be active at very small doses, but very potent once in the environment, and they can affect wildlife. Where we have share systems with wildlife, we have 7% share of physiology with fish, so we're all 70% fish. And thus we can expect the same targets in the chemistry that reaches us, affects us, also affects our fisheries. In fact, research that has been conducted elsewhere in the world on pharmaceuticals and fish shows that all aspects of the life of fish are affected by pharmaceutical exposure. Their feeding, their activity, where they're in space, their habitat use, their migration are all affected. This has huge implications for reproduction and survival of our fisheries and consequences for the population as a whole and for the entire ecosystem, the entire habitat and all the species living in it. So in our study, we wanted to ask, are pharmaceuticals a concern for South Florida fisheries? We focus on bonefish as a model species because they're a really critical part of our valuable recreational fisheries. And we've seen recent population declines that are a concern, a conservation concern over the past decades. They also live near shore, close to human populations and potential sources of contamination. And they're forage in the sediment, which is known to harbor pollutants over time. So we asked us a number of questions focusing on what are pharmaceuticals, what is it a concern for South Florida? And we asked these 4 questions or sub-questions, if you will, in our study. The first, are there a problem? Are there a problem for our fisheries focusing on South Florida? As Jim described, we fished 93 bonefish throughout South Florida. We took blood samples and we analyzed them for 104 commonly prescribed pharmaceuticals. Then we asked, is the problem everywhere? Here we spread our sampling and our fishing from Biscayne Bay, surrounded by Miami, to the Upper Keys, Lower Keys, and then this area west of Key West, where we have much less human presence, including the Lakes Passage, the Marquesas, and the Dry Tortugas. We asked, how big of a problem is it? And here we try to look at the concentrations we found, with not just presence or absence, but what levels of pharmaceuticals are we finding? And here we compared what we found in bonefish, in the blood of bonefish, to what we find in the blood of a human being. So when your doctor gives you a prescription, the prescription has a targeted concentration that is desired in your bloodstream for you to have that effect, that positive effect of the medication. That's called a therapeutic level. And based on previous literature, we compared the concentrations that we found in bonefish to that therapeutic level. And we assumed, or we created this threshold that if we see 1/3 of that therapeutic level in bonefish, we're expected, and we think the fish have either the desired effect of the drug, the targeted effect, or the side effect, or both. So we use this 1/3 threshold as an indication of how serious the concern is for the contamination. And last, we asked, how are they being exposed? And we looked at the food. We looked at the mud crabs, the shrimp, and the toadfish they eat, and asked whether or not they are also having these same pharmaceuticals that we find in bonefish. So we're looking for the same 104 pharmaceuticals in these little tiny prey items. So I'd like to walk you through the findings next and see what we found, and we'll go question by question. So on the first question, are pharmaceuticals a problem? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. In this graphic, you can see the number of pharmaceuticals we found per bonefish. You can see there are no zeros. We found between 1 and as high as 17 pharmaceuticals per bonefish. The average was 7 pharmaceuticals per bonefish. A total of 58 pharmaceuticals were detected. And this included, the most detected were blood pressure medications, antidepressants, and prostate medications. It's worth noting that these cocktails, the effect of these cocktails are unknown, but we know they're expected to be highly severe. These are the counter effects and the warnings from our doctors, right? Not to mix our medications. And most of our fish, except for one, have these cocktails of pharmaceuticals that should be very concerning for the effects. The second question, is it a problem everywhere? And the question is yes. In this graphic, you can see the number of pharmaceuticals by region going from north to south, Biscayne Bay, Upper Keys, Lower Keys, and west of Key West. And pharmaceuticals are found in all regions. We found very high levels of pharmaceuticals in Biscayne Bay, expected. We're near urbanized areas, surrounded by 2.4 million people in the county. And we see those high levels. But we also saw high levels in remote areas in west of Key West. These are areas that are 5 to 60 miles away from the nearest urban center. And then a little bit lower levels through the upper Keys and lower Keys. So we're going from 8 pharmaceuticals of the high areas, North End and South End, to about 6 in the upper Keys and lower Keys. Then how big of a problem is this? Well, it's really big. It's very serious, and most fish are affected. When we use a 1/3 therapeutic concentration as a threshold, we found that 56% of our fish were affected. 56% were above that 1/3, the human therapeutic level. Again, the prescription, the target concentration your doctor wants you to have in your blood with that prescription. The upper Keys had the lowest incidence or exceedance, excuse me, when we look at by region on that bottom graphic, but everywhere else, Biscayne Bay, lower Keys, west of Key West were above 60 or 60% of our fish. Heart medications, antihistamines, and antidepressants were the most likely to exceed that 1/3 threshold. Just to give you a sense of how serious this can get for our bonefish, here's one of our most affected fish. This is fish number 43. It was collected, sampled in the in the Lakes Passage between Key West and Marquesas. This fish had 16 pharmaceuticals. It had 8 antidepressants, and the levels were very serious, between 10 to 300 times the human level. Again, this is 10 to 300 times the human level of pharmaceuticals, and it had 8 of them. It also had 3 heart medications, 1 Parkinson's disease medication, an antihistamine, an antifungal drug, stomach medications, and an opiate, all in the same fish. Last are how we're being exposed. Our last question, are we looking here at the food? And the answer is yes, this is also in their food, and the food could be a major pathway for exposure. Exposure may occur via inhalation, contact with the sediment is contaminated through the water or through the food. And here we see that the food is really high. On the top panel, you see the number of pharmaceuticals and these tiny prey items. These are crabs, shrimp, small fish. And this ranges between 3 pharmaceuticals to 24 pharmaceuticals per fish. In fact, the prey have more pharmaceuticals than the bonefish. On average, we found 11 pharmaceuticals in these tiny prey items versus 7 in the bonefish themselves. All the prey tested had pharmaceuticals. For instance, you can see the mud crabs have a little bit more than shrimp and toadfish. And these were the same types of pharmaceuticals that were found in the bonefish. So on to our conclusions. I've shown you enough evidence that pharmaceuticals can in fact pose a threat to our fisheries, and this is a serious threat. The contamination, the lack of removal, and the contact of our fisheries with the effluent is a concern, and it's resulting in pharmaceutical contamination. We have high and concerning levels of exposure in the bonefish that should have serious effects on their health and their populations. The exposure is also near places of human contact and also very far in areas that we think are pristine. Just pointing out the expansiveness of the issue. We have high numbers also in the prey, suggesting that exposure is not just for bonefish alone as a special case of a fishery that's susceptible, but it's also probably for all of our fisheries, because all of our coastal fisheries are eating little crabs, shrimp, and little fish. So how do we fix this? This is a huge problem. So we need additional steps in wastewater treatment to remove those pharmaceuticals and all these new contaminants we're putting in the environment, these new micropollutants. Sweden and Switzerland are leading the charge in this, and they have turned to ozonation as a very cost-effective treatment step that's added to the conventional wastewater treatment. We really need to rethink the way we think about wastewater, because it's becoming, at the same time, we're too damaging for our environment and too valuable. We're going to need that water, and it's going to have to be cleaned up. And last, we need to apply sustainability thinking to our wastewater so that it can become a safe source of water, fertilizer, and energy in the future. This is a huge opportunity for Florida to lead. Thank you for your attention. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Adams next.
Thanks, Jen. So with that as a foundation, my job is to talk about why it matters. That it's not just a bonefish issue, but that it's much larger. So the question is, what about other fish and fisheries? So the Florida Keys has a lot of tidal flushing. There's a lot of ocean currents, a lot of moving water. It's only partly urbanized, yet we're finding very high concentrations of pharmaceuticals and bonefish. But what about all the other urbanized estuaries within the state of Florida? Tampa Bay, which is shown here, is a great example. Charlotte Harbor, Biscayne Bay, Jacksonville, Indian River Lagoon. They all have mixes of wastewater treatment through sewage facilities and septic systems and other sources, all of which are providing access for pharmaceuticals into estuarine environments. And there's a lot of other recreational fisheries that occur in Florida. Redfish, snook, trout are among the three, and those are the species that people consume as well, whereas bonefish is entirely catch and release. And we don't know what's going on with those species at this point. Bonefish is, as Jen said, is our model species, is kind of our canary in the coal mine. So from an economic perspective, fisheries are extremely important in Florida. Right? Florida is known as the fishing capital of the world for good reason. The recreational saltwater fishery has an annual economic impact of $9.2 billion. And these numbers are about a year old, so it's probably higher. Over 88,000 jobs. Just the Florida Keys flats fishery, which is bonefish, tarpon, and permit, is $465 million a year. If you blow that up to the Everglades region, at this point, this is a 10-year-old study, it's more than $1 billion. You throw in recreational freshwater fishing, that's over $4.5 billion with over 31,000 jobs. And then you throw in the commercial fishery, which is over $3 billion and over 76,000 jobs. So the fisheries that we're talking about that are likely being impacted by pharmaceuticals have a large economic impact in the state of Florida. And these fisheries combined are larger than many other sectors of Florida's economy. We're just now learning of the impact of pharmaceuticals, but these fisheries, all of which depend upon healthy habitats and clean water, are already at a deficit. You can see here, 50% of our mangroves, say from 100, 150 years ago, are already gone. Many acres of wetlands, seagrass, some areas have lost most or all of their oysters. All of these provide essential habitats for the fisheries, and they also help to filter the water. So the fisheries are already kind of have a challenge. And we all know about our various water quality issues. It's fantastic that the governor and the legislature have allocated historic levels of funding to fix the Everglades, as you can see from that top picture, what the flow used to be, what it is now, and it will go back to something closer to what it used to be. But these water flow alterations, with whether it's stormwater or wastewater, are also true elsewhere. This is in the lower right is a picture of runoff, wastewater or stormwater runoff coming off of Route 1 into the Indian River Lagoon. So there's a lot of issues throughout the state that have implications for our fisheries. But the good thing is we have a great path forward. The governor and the legislature have already made water quality a priority like it hasn't been before. With record funding, as Jim said earlier. There's also been key policy changes that are very helpful. And the thing about the pharmaceuticals is they're a proxy for all these other issues. And so they give us the impetus to continue this investment. What we're spending now is fantastic. It should be considered a great start of a long-term investment. And we can build on the progress. I show this slide here. This shows the various aquifers in Florida that we rely on for our well-being and those of our coastal fisheries. And you can see that we're all connected. We can't just fix one place and assume we're fine. The aquifers connect us all, and they connect all of our fisheries. And we have to keep that in mind as this is a statewide challenge. We also have to continue to work with state and federal partners because it's only going to become more of a challenge. Right now, we are addressing the problems that those who came before us created. And we were left with the bill, but we have to pay it. On the right side of this picture is projected development in 2070. So the issues that we have now with development are only going to continue. And so we have to get our house in order now so that we can handle this in the future and still have our healthy fisheries. And so altogether, building upon what's already been done or is being done here in Tallahassee, thinking of this as a long-term issue, we think will benefit our fisheries greatly. And we think that Florida can really be a global leader. The colleagues in places like Sweden and Switzerland, Germany are doing some of this work, but as Jen said, this is a global issue. And Florida has the opportunity to become a global leader in this. And with that, I will stop and we'll take any questions or we'll...
Actually, we want to invite Representative Payne to make comments.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. certainly I see a lot of friends in the room. And Secretary Valentine, it's good to see you again. You've nailed it. That's all I can say. You've nailed it. So many of the things that you said, both docs, are thoughts I've had. I am a water guy. I see you're a wild fish activist. That's what I feel like when I'm here. I love to fish. I'm in the water. I love to surf. I'm always in the water. And so therefore I had a passion for water, need for water policy changes. And we worked very close to the Secretary over several years and Senator Mayfield to make sure that we had perhaps a comprehensive policy change 2 years ago that was the beginning steps of where we need to be going in the state. As you've heard, the legislature, the governor, the speaker, the president are certainly committed to making sure we understand that land and water are inextricably connected in the state of Florida. That's who we are. People come to Florida to live, play, enjoy recreational outdoors, and to spend time fishing and spend time in the water. We know the water quality issues for years have been something, as Doctor said, that we are behind the 8 ball on. And it's something that won't change overnight. It's something that we have to continue to work on in placing good policy, looking at new technologies, and letting the science lead us to where we need to be. I like the fact that we follow the science. This group, the BTT, follows the science in order to make sure they're making the right changes for the habitat. We can get overwhelmed with subjective opinions as to what problems are. The pharmaceutical discussion has been one we've had occasionally. It only makes sense. It makes good common sense that, and I love the canary in the coal mine comment. In fact, that's exactly what I was thinking of with bonefish when you said that, is that maybe the leading indicator of what we're able to sample or measure at this time, but it's only the beginning of where we need to go. You know, you have the commitment, I think, certainly for me and some other members and the future speaker, Renner, to know that we are focused on Florida as a habitat. We're focused on Florida, and I hate to say it this way, but we've got a people problem. We've got so many people coming to Florida that love Florida. I had this discussion with one of my roommates this morning, and the people problem leads to exacerbation of all the things that we see and just heard about. We have to figure out a better way to manage that. Managing that through better wastewater treatments, managing that through septic to sewer conversions, managing that through runoff, biosolids use. All of those things are all inputs into the equation that has created the problem. And we need to evaluate those inputs to make sure that at the end of the equation, we find a better remedy. Technology will lead us to that through microfiltration, but we have to have policy changes and funding to make sure we support that. It's a long road. We've got a long way to go, but I certainly appreciate the work that you do. I have a greater appreciation for the BTT now that I've spent some time, actually last night about midnight, reading about you, look at your bios, and want to make sure that I'm able to partner and engage in the conversations to drive the policy, to help support the technology, to look at the things as we continue to look at it from a scientific perspective, that we're doing the right things for water quality and water quantity in the state of Florida. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Look, I'd like to cancel my meetings for the next 3 hours and stay here if I could. I really enjoyed that. But I'll make sure that as we move forward, and Andrew knows, we'll make sure we're connecting with the right people to have this conversation. It's a bigger conversation than what we're having here today, but we look forward to making sure that the conversation is had, and we understand, as you clearly alluded to, understanding the science, it gives us a pathway forward so that we can do the right things to support policy and funding. So thank you for that. I can take a question or two. Kelly, did you have a few questions? Okay. Oh yeah, sure, certainly, I'm sorry. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. We're going to take some of the questions from our virtual participants, but we did want to start off with one for Representative Payne. If you could talk about your expectations for this year's budget and any potential to support water quality efforts.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think this year's budget will be a combination of many good things. We've seen the commitment from the governor and both sides of the House and the Senate as far as what that number will be. You know, my opinion, we have to strike that balance. Secretary Valentine can tell you that it's hard to strike a balance in all the things that we manage on a day-to-day basis. You know, you can say, well, we're putting funding here, but we're removing some funding opportunities from something else that may have a major issue, a healthcare issue, a child education issue. So striking that balance is the hard part. I think we're on the leading cusp of greater funding and greater opportunities. So I can't give you a dollar number, but I know we have strong revenue opportunities this year. And I think you'll continue to see the increased funding because of the efforts you'll see from the governor and the legislature in knowing that this is critical to us. This is what Florida is. Florida is about water as a primary source of understanding what our needs are. As a peninsular state, we have to understand where those pinch points are and ways to address them. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, but I would say that there is commitment for additional funding, research, and opportunities.
Thank you, very helpful. We had a question come in from Kate at USA Today Network, Florida. Her question is, what is the potential effect on humans who ingest fish contaminated with any variety of pharmaceuticals that they don't need / weren't prescribed? Who would like to take that question?
I can take that and get it started. The threat, so we do know it's in our drinking water. We have the pharmaceuticals in our drinking water. We also have them in our fish that we consume. Now, there are very low doses of those pharmaceuticals. And yet there's a mix of them. As you saw in the bonefish, we found 58. So we can presume there's tons of those in our drinking water and in our food. The risk is very small because the concentrations are very small, but no one knows what it means for us to be exposed over our lifetimes to many, many pharmaceuticals at very, very low dosages for our entire lives.
Interesting, thank you.
Unsatisfying answer perhaps, but yeah, this is where we are.
Wanted to field an additional question. You tested bonefish in South Florida and the Keys. What are the expectations for other species and target areas?
That's a fantastic question. And for our saltwater species, we really don't know. This is the first study of saltwater fish in Florida and pharmaceuticals. So our concern, as I mentioned in one of the slides, is that we have a lot of recreational fish that are consumed, which goes to the previous question, that also spend their lives within estuaries rather than in more open ocean areas like bonefish. So for example, where I live in Indian River Lagoon, it's mostly enclosed. Redfish, snook, trout spend their entire lives within the lagoon. And with the issues that we're having in the lagoon with nutrients and pharmaceuticals are in that same mix, yeah, I think this is a really good motivator to examine many of those other species for both our own health, human health reasons, but also for the ecosystem. Because research on other species has shown that these pharmaceuticals affect behavior, reproduction, which affects our fisheries. And combined, that's $16 billion a year. And so I think it's well worth the investment to repeat this study for other fish in Florida so we can get a handle on it, because you can't deal with it until you get a handle on it.
Thank you. And for the online participants, that was Dr. Aaron Adams, VTT's Director of Science and Conservation. And prior to that, answering the question was Dr. Jen Rehage, FIU's Coastal Fisheries Research Lab, lead researcher on the study. Another question for you all. What do you envision for the next steps from a science perspective here?
I can start it, yeah. We have so many more questions, I think. The scale, addressing how big of a, I guess we can say that whenever people have gone in the world and they've looked for pharmaceuticals, they find them. So we're just getting to that, being one of those now, Florida added to that list of places where we know contamination is coming in. Once you get these chemicals out in the world, then they get everywhere. So we certainly know it's present. The information from the bonefish and their prey is very informative, yet we have so many more questions about the effects, right? What does it do exactly to our fisheries? And are there any places safe from these pharmaceuticals? This is one of the things I like to know. Is there a place where I can go to a fish and get a blood sample and it's not going to come full of pharmaceuticals? So that's my first question.
I think also from a, thinking from the conservation perspective, to the extent that these pharmaceuticals influence fish behavior, we're really concerned about reproduction. For bonefish, for example, we know they have a pretty small home range during much of the year, maybe a couple square miles. But then to go spawn, which typically occurs during winter, they'll migrate. We've tracked them in the Bahamas migrating 70 miles each way from their home range to spawning spot and back. So to the extent that these pharmaceuticals affect their migratory behavior, their ability to spawn is a big concern to us. We know enough about bonefish spawning now that we can find the spawning aggregations or schools of bonefish in the Bahamas, in Cuba, in Belize, because we know what to look for. We've been looking for those spawning aggregations in the Florida Keys for going on 10 years, and we're getting closer, but it's proving much harder to find them. And so we're concerned, and this is complete, you ask what next steps on research are that reproduction? Are these pharmaceuticals affecting the ability of bonefish to successfully spawn in the Keys? And when they're part of a $465 million fishery, even if you don't fish for bonefish, if you're in the Florida Keys, that's part of your livelihood too, because that's a major part of the income for the state.
Representative Payne, I know you must leave. I want to thank you again for your leadership and engagement on these water quality issues and your participation today.
Thank you, Jim, and thank everyone. Let me just make one last comment. I know that as we've heard today, that is the area that you're focusing on with bonefish and tarpon and permit. I fish in the Northeast in the St. John's, Volusia, Flagler County areas. I'm a redfish, trout, and flounder guy. But as you begin to look at those other species, I'll let you know that I'm available to help you catch them. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Representative. We do have a couple other questions. We have a few minutes where we can still answer some of those. So next, are there opportunities to work with other colleges and universities to further this research? Would you all like to talk about that?
Sure, that's an excellent question. Our whole approach to doing the research to apply to conservation is one of collaboration. So we work with, at Bonefish Tarpon Trust, we work with FIU, we work with FAU, University of Miami, University of Florida, and then spreading out through the country, University of Massachusetts, for example, Texas, and then globally. The studies in part with colleagues from Sweden. Canada, it's important to us to work with people who are experts in their field to address issues that are important to conservation. So it's very much a collaborative effort, but it's not just universities. It's important for people to understand it's also with the stakeholders. And those stakeholders could be working with the state, as we're up here now sharing our information, or with, say, the national parks in the Keys. But it's also with the fishing community, and then the others that depend on the water for their livelihoods. So it's got to be a multi-partner type of interaction for sure, with inputs and then sharing the information throughout that process.
Excellent. We do have another question from USA Today Network. Are there plans to test for other ways pharmaceuticals may be impacting the health of bonefish? If so, is there anything in particular you'll be looking for?
Yeah, I can take that. We have studied, or I guess worldwide, that most of the work that we know very well about antidepressants and what they do to bonefish. So that's going to be one of the things we do. And what antidepressants were one of the main things we found, and the exceedances that I showed were also most likely to be antidepressants. And they affect the behavior of fish. This has been done on other species and the Baltic Sea, and everything about those fish is affected. So we're going to look for those signs, particularly with antidepressants, because they're so pervasive in the data, and look for signs of those effects that are expected and we have seen in other species of bonefish, and the sociability of the fish, how fast they move, how fast they migrate, how fast they eat, where do they spend their time. All of that has changed when they're exposed to these antidepressants. So we're going to look for those signs in our bonefish.
Perfect. Thank you. We are closing into the very end of our Q&A session. Would love to make sure everybody knows where to get more information. If you guys could share where can we find more resources, where do we go online?
Sure. Our website is btt.org or bonefishtarpontrust.org. There's links to this study and all the other studies that we're involved in, as well as ways that you can get involved in those. That's your best clearinghouse is btt.org.
Perfect. Does anyone in the audience have any questions you'd like to ask? Anyone physically here? Okay. Thank you. Closing remarks, I think we're ready for those.
As a closing remark, I think it's, again, to reiterate, it's fantastic to see the change in how Tallahassee to actually invest in our water issues. And it's fantastic to see the energy to continue that investment. This has happened as from a water quality perspective, not the pharmaceuticals, of course, in other places. And it's taken a long-term, decades level investment to get it fixed. And I think that it's great to have people interested in this, to follow up on this research. So 10 years from now, we can be telling success stories.
Well said.
We'll go for it.
Thank you.
Well said. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. This was fascinating and very important.
Applause is good.